Approximately 1 year ago today, a nightmare before Christmas will unfold. In the evening hours of December 10th, 2021, 102 tornadoes would drop from the sky between now and 6 a.m. in the morning, along with over 300 reports of wind and hail. We would also have a supercell that would travel across 4 states, and numerous other big cities would be hit by strong and violent tornadoes. Yes, that's right. Today we're covering the December 10th and 11th severe weather outbreak. In order to understand how this event unfolded, we actually have to look back. When we look back at the temperatures in the days ahead leading up to the outbreak, there was an area around the Tennessee and Ohio valleys that were seeing temperatures 10 to potentially even 25 degrees above average in some places. Unseasonably and unthinkably warm temperatures for this month. The temperatures in the mid to upper 70s and 80s for even some people. This would be the first part of many that would set this event into motion. When we look back at this significant outbreak, the probability of severe weather wasn't really picked up on until actually day 3. This was us looking back towards day 5, 6, 7, and 8, and all of them had predictability too low due to the uncertainty of the system at the time. But by day 3, we have a very large slight risk area that ends up being issued across the Ozarks, Missouri, Mississippi River Valley, the Tennessee Valley, and the Ohio Valley as well. And as time will go on, the confidence would increase on a more significant storm coming forth. Thus, this is where we get the enhanced risk issued. And this starts to cover the western half of Kentucky here, eastern parts of Arkansas, and the southeastern parts of Missouri. Also, we can't disinclude parts of southwestern Indiana and southeastern Iowa. By day 1, that enhanced risk area will start to grow. And now it stretches back a little bit further to the west and also makes a push to the north. Now we're starting to get central Illinois involved. We're starting to get central Tennessee involved. We even get parts of Alabama involved. And then by the time we get to, I'd say, the early afternoon hours, this is where our moderate risk gets issued. It's a small area where our quad state supercell would eventually fire. And of course, lo and behold, northeastern Arkansas will be in play, and then southeastern Mississippi would be involved. This area does end up growing, by the way, just a tiny bit. It pushes back a little further west, and by about 2000 hours or 2000 Z, which would probably translate more or less towards about 5 o'clock. This is just about a couple hours before some of the bigger storms start to fire. That's when things start to get out of hand. That's when our moderate risk is issued with a mostly dominant tornado threat here. This is the probabilistic tornado outlook at the time this was issued, and we have our 15% area. It's pretty high. It's a pretty high number, even though it doesn't sound like it. It's just how the National Weather Service does things. But 15% is indicative of a moderate risk, and this is also in a hatched region, which indicates the probability of strong to violent tornadoes ranging between EF2 and higher. And notice that this even goes through our enhanced risk region here, which is the 10% area. So it's no surprise that any storm that would begin to rotate over this environment would start to produce strong to violent tornadoes, and unfortunately that's what ended up occurring. One other thing to note with this storm system, though, is there was a big, just damaging straight line wind threat, and this stretched all the way through into the Ohio Valley almost through the Tennessee Valley and the Mississippi River Valley as well. And it's even stretched back as far as parts of eastern Texas as far as the slight risk is concerned. The hail threat was a little bit more minimized due to the fact that you don't have these super unstable environments. Therefore, we struggle to get those updrafts to be as strong as what you would see during the spring and summertime. Thus, our hail threat was a little lower. There was still a large amount of hail that ended up falling from this outbreak as well. And this is the early morning hours of the 10th. We can see here that our trough has begun to develop at this point. And as we move this forward, we start to see this dig further and further to the south and east. What you also may not have noticed here is that there's a little wind maximum that progressively works its way off to the north and east as well, and starts to hang around the mid-Ohio Valley and the Tennessee valleys here. And this is the first key part of what would set the stage for the upcoming severe weather and violent tornado outbreak. As we get towards the afternoon hours, we look again that jet streak has now started to work its way a little bit further to the east. And right around the time the storm's fire, which I'd say is about maybe 7 o'clock here, look at this wind maximum that pops up here. And also one other thing to note here with this upper level jet. This isn't the low level jet, by the way. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the upper level jet, notice that these waves aren't quite as distorted as these. They're very subtle. And this was a key component to what ended up becoming that quad state supercell. It's because when the waves are subtle like this, there's not a lot of vigorous forcing that creates multiple storms. You do need forcing to create severe thunderstorms, but not a lot. And if you want discrete supercells that can produce long track tornadoes, this is how you get it. This little area right here, look how the waves are almost straight, I would even call it, or zonal in the weather world. Right around here, when these storms would fire, they would lift up and they'd have plenty of room to breathe. And with this quad state supercell, this was, for a while, it was the only storm around. So there was no other storms to interfere with it, getting all the warm air and dynamics that it would need in order to sustain itself for an extended period of time, which is exactly what happened. Go ahead and take a look at the low level jet. And the look's not too much, and the look is not too dissimilar. We'll go up to about the early afternoon and evening hours. And this is the real like key component right here. Is just out ahead of where the main trough is. There's this jet streak right here at the low levels. One other thing to make note of is you can kind of see these little wind barbs right here. If you made the comparison between the 500 millibar and the 850, you notice that they're in different directions. This is what we call directional shear, and there's also a difference in speed shear. We had nearly a 70-80 mile per hour jet just off to the west of this. And in this area, it looks like we're getting more towards, I'd say, about 50-60 knots based off this map here. There could be some stronger points as well, but with the speed and directional shear and an environment where only one storm would form, like I said, all the dynamics here basically would be focused on that one storm, and it would just go uninhibited, producing tornado after tornado after tornado. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the only storm that would end up producing tornadoes, some of which were violent. When you look at the environment as a whole, though, we look at the Cape values, which is which is indicative of the instability in the atmosphere. This is just looking at the surface base cape. And this is getting towards the evening hours when the outbreak started to unfold. Plenty of areas were already reaching that 1,000 joules per kilogram as we get towards about 7 o'clock. And right around here, this is where I want you to pay the most attention here. Around this point here where we get this little bit of what we call an instability nose, a warm nose. Look exactly where it is. Right about here towards western, or maybe even western central Kentucky, let's call it that. And this is where ultimately some of the most damage would end up occurring. So when we look at the when we look at the dynamics overall, we now have our target area over towards western Kentucky. Only thing to do now is just sit and wait. Here's a final look at it, a sounding just before the outbreak would start to unfold here. With the increasing cape here starting to reach 2,000 joules per kilogram, just off the Arkansas-Missouri border. The high dew point temperatures nearing 70 degrees, with the air temperature reaching 70 degrees as well, along with the wind profile and the storm relative helicities in particular being 309 meters squared per second. The environment was set to go. And by 3 p.m., our first tornado watch would be issued. This would be a particularly dangerous situation tornado watch, with a high probability of tornadoes, some of which would be violent. It wouldn't take too much longer after this first watch would be issued for things to unravel. This is the initial radar at that moment. And once we move this to mesoscale discussion 1986, and there were many other discussions throughout that day, not just only for severe weather but snow. We would see what looks like our first supercell here, and this one would end up being the quad state supercell. This was issued at 6:22, right around the time where this started to form. By this point, the tornado is starting to work its way into or around Monette. This was said to be at about EF2 strength from what I remember. I don't necessarily have the diagram in my grasp at the moment. But we'll move these along here to discussion 1991. And this is talking about this exact area where the storm would be having increased tornado potential about an hour later. By this point, the storm has already moved through, and it's working its way into that high energy area right here towards the Arkansas-Missouri border, where we're looking at the extensively high cape values and impressive storm relative helicities. We all know what happens next at this point, unfortunately. By this point, of course, once it passes through this area, this storm becomes very violent very quickly. And it says strong to potentially, and at this point, meso discussion is issued for this particular storm with the words strong to potentially violent tornado. And is expected to persist. And the meso discussions with this storm would continue. This is the meso discussion towards almost 9 o'clock Central Time. This is nearly 3 hours already after this storm has begun, actually. And intense tornado threat continues, with this particular storm being at the forefront. We'll move this along another couple of mesoscale discussions, and you can almost even see the little hook echo appendage popping out from this supercell alone. Almost even seeing a debris ball signature, which is eerie because you almost never see the Storm Prediction Center highlight a storm with this much detail. It's rare. And we can skip this along and we'll keep seeing hints of this storm right here. This is at 10:44 p.m. Central Time. Strong to intense tornado damage, highlighting this exact supercell. It's unbelievable to think about, something that I didn't think I would see in this lifetime. I can remember vividly watching Ryan Hall's broadcast as he was live streaming this tornado from start to finish, just hitting town after town at this point. It was almost mind blowing. I had a pit in my stomach too, just thinking about it. Unfortunately, though, this wasn't the only, like I said before, this wasn't the only storm with extreme tornado potential. Just south of the Kentucky line towards Tennessee, a significant tornado threat would materialize there, and these would end up becoming the storms that would end up going through southern Kentucky. And one of these would ultimately end up hitting the town of Bowling Green. A lot of people forget about that during this tornado outbreak. It wasn't just that one supercell that caused mass destruction. It was a multitude of them, because we ended up getting 102 tornado reports. We can't forget there were also tornadoes in Illinois and Indiana as well, even pushing towards Ohio. There were even a couple in Mississippi and Alabama, if I remember correctly, too. This was a very wide-reaching severe weather event. But as we continue to look on, when we jump to mesoscale discussion 2008, lo and behold, our supercell is still going, still very impressive looking, and producing a strong tornado at this point. By this point, the tornado has hit Mayfield, or is getting close to it. And this is by 11:53. We have dealt with this storm for nearly 5 hours. There's been a multitude of tornado emergencies, PDS tornado warnings, and confirmations of damage, including fatalities at this point. As we look further to the south, however, a much greater tornado threat emerges to the south of this main storm. This ultimately, however, ends up cutting off that storm and starting to limit that one's potential. But as this environment has remained untapped, the increased potential of tornadic activity here grows. Some towns here, being preoccupied watching what happened in Mayfield, were not going to be prepared for the storms that would come in to this region here. The onslaught seems to continue even as we get into the early morning hours, as strong tornado potential would continue to persist and a multitude of supercells would form over this region. It's during this time frame where Bowling Green would be hit. Finally, by the time we get to about 3 in the morning, the main tornado threat is starting to end as the main line of storm starts to come through. And by about 5 a.m., the worst is finally over. Total of those 102 tornado reports, 66 tornadoes would be confirmed. Many of these would have long track paths, and a fair number of these would be considered as strong to violent tornadoes, several earning EF3 and EF4 ratings. The Mayfield tornado alone would be the longest track tornado in the month of December and one of the deadliest, killing 57 people by itself. It would also be one of the strongest tornadoes too, with winds clocked in around 190 miles per hour, with even a rumor of a reading above about maybe a couple thousand feet above the ground of winds over 200 miles per hour, which would have made it an EF5 should those winds have translated to the surface and caused damage. This would not be the case, however. However, in spite of all the darkness that would unfold on this day, people of Mayfield would not be defined by this moment. As we've looked now, this is a recovery effort. I can't click in on this for obvious reasons, but as we can see here, the top of this imagery, you don't even have to really guess what this is. This is the damage path the day after the event unfolded. By the summer, a lot of buildings had already been A lot of rebuilding had already been taking place here, and things are starting to look a lot more natural now as we start to progress towards the fall of 2022. As we reach the 1 year anniversary of this outbreak, I'm sure a lot of people will struggle a little bit with this day. But just as they've survived this and recovered, soon these wounds too will heal. This is the end of the documentary here. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. You guys have a good night. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed that documentary. It's my first time doing one, so of course there's a lot that I can improve on here. But ultimately, it was an interesting process. There was a lot going on behind the scenes when I was doing this as well, so maybe a little, may not be the best that you've ever seen, but it's a work in progress. I'm thinking about doing more of these in the future, maybe a little bit better, a little bit more intricate. And speaking of intricate, one other thing that I'd like to bring up also is, while I was able to pull up information on the recovery of Mayfield, one other thing that I'd like to make note of is the fact that there are plenty of other towns that were heavily affected by this tornado outbreak, and not even, and areas that were also affected by beyond just tornadoes too. So I urge you to also go ahead and take a look at this story map that I had found here. I'm pulling up right now. This goes over every tornado that unfolded that day. And the reason why I bring that up is because I'm sure there are some areas that still haven't quite recovered as well as Mayfield, because Mayfield's the area that got the media attention. Some people forgot that there were tornadoes in places like Bowling Green and even smaller towns than that. So I urge you to look up some of these tornadoes to see if anyone might still need help, if it's in your heart to give a helping hand. I just thought I'd come in at the end of this video to drop that message along. But that being said, this has been Tired Metalhead Weatherman. I'll see you guys in the next one.